done. A brave gentleman indeed. I don't pick on people, I promise. So, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Mark Wallace. I'm the Chief Executive of ConservativeHome. Thank you very much here in Westminster and at home around the UK and around the world watching online for joining us for this first ConservativeHome Powering the Nation conference held in partnership with BP. We're very proud at ConservativeHome to be expanding beyond the party conference fringe events many of you will have seen to go year-round with these series of thematic half-day conferences, of which this is the second. And we've got a fantastic lineup ahead today. Energy, such a small, uncontroversial issue. We've allocated half a day to basically get it all sorted by noon. We'll be covering everything from energy security and independence, the debate about net zero and decarbonisation, new technologies, and of course, welcoming a government minister to deliver our keynote speech later this morning. But without further ado, it falls to me firstly to lay out a couple of house rules. So we will be welcoming questions from the audience on each of our panel sessions. As I will say later, they must be questions, please, not just a 10-minute speech followed by a question mark appended to the end, or there will be consequences from the tyrannical chair. But particularly we're starting with our first panel on the topic security and investment, building resilience into the UK's energy supply. It seems almost surreal to think of the energy debate over several decades now in the way that it's been, in some ways, allocated to be one of merely technical discussion or one that's been left purely to discuss, say, within industry, as if there are not, as we know, domestic cost of living concerns, but also impacts on domestic security, national infrastructure, and foreign policy. We now find ourselves in a situation where, for a variety of reasons, the UK faces vulnerability on various aspects of its energy policy. We have a hostile foreign dictatorship openly using energy dependence upon the energy that it produces as a weapon of weapon to extend warfare, to try and influence the UK's foreign and defence policy via the medium of its energy policy. And we're very, very fortunate to start to explore some of these topics, to be joined by an illustrious panel. I will ask each of them to deliver some brief opening remarks, then we'll go into a wider discussion, bring in some audience questions, and it will therefore follow a format which will be familiar to many of you. First, I'd like to welcome Josh Buckland, a partner at Flint, former advisor on energy to the Business Secretary, former advisor on energy and environmental policy in Downing Street. I did say at the start we had an illustrious panel. Please give them a warm welcome. Over to you.
Thanks, Mark. That's very kind, and lovely to see you all this morning. I was going to cover kind of three quick things to kick off, and then very keen to get into questions which we've heard from the other much more illustrious panel members. Firstly, a little bit on kind of the approach to security and supply in government. From my experience, spent about a decade on energy through various guises of Conservative government. A little bit then on the import versus homegrown energy debate, and then finish on just kind of what government can practically do to try and enhance security supply moving forward, to try and make the conversation a bit more practical. I think firstly, I must admit, I'm slightly frustrated by some of the media coverage recently that government has not thought about security supply over the course of the last 10 to 15 years. I can tell you, having been in Downing Street, having sat in a room in Downing Street, counting power stations on a map every winter in advance of a security situation, that government does take security supply very, very, very seriously. And actually the Prime Minister, in my experience, especially David Cameron initially and through, has always seen, when it comes to energy policy, as energy security is their key priority. And I think it's slightly wrong, and it's been slightly conflated in the press around how a distraction around the climate agenda, or alternatively other drivers of energy policy, have shifted a focus away from security supply, at least in the short term. I think where the criticism is, I think, more justified is that we haven't thought enough about security supply 10 to 15 years ahead. So the focus has largely been, and in those discussions I was part of, much more around security supply for this winter or next, much less about what capacity and what infrastructure do you need to build to ensure the security of the system and that you're inherently resilient to foreign threats over a 10 to 15 year period. And I think that's the conversation that needs to happen, because in reality, there's very little we can do about security supply this winter beyond emergency measures, which we'd all like to try and avoid for next time round. So I think it's worth just creating that nuance in the security discussion as we move forward. Secondly, I think it'd be good to talk a little bit today about, obviously, the debate around homegrown versus imported energy. I don't think anyone would disagree that there is a key and clear argument for more homegrown energy supply. It's very odd to think that we would not prioritise that. In reality, we do that in a range of different areas, whether it's critical industries, whether it's other sources of critical supply chains. There's nothing wrong and there's nothing jingoistic about talking about the need for more homegrown energy, and I think we shouldn't be defensive around that. That said, we can't expect to be 100% self-reliant with very little import capacity. We don't demand that in any other critical markets, food, car production, any other areas. What we do is we create a balance. We try and maximise homegrown supply, whilst also looking for stable and solid supply chains, and that's exactly what we should be doing in the energy side. And interestingly, actually, there's also a quite interesting nuance in the energy side that we should think through. Actually, there is nothing wrong to say that we can be 100% self-reliant when it comes to electricity. We are seeing a huge drive of electricity capacity in the UK. We're building a shed load of offshore wind. Hopefully we're finally going to get to build some nuclear power stations now. We're also starting to look at other options like gas CCS, as well as other sources like hydrogen power. And if you look at the projections in a net zero world, there is no reason to say we can't produce more electricity in the UK than we actually utilise, and therefore be an electricity exporter by the late 2040s. And that's an ambition that Rishi Sunak talked about over the summer leadership campaign, and it's absolutely a commitment that we should be pushing against. What's less credible is to say that we can be 100% self-reliant on oil and gas. We already have less than half of our supplies from oil and gas in a domestic context, and that is largely driven by the economics, but also just about capacity and constraint on supply. And that number critically needs to stay around that level for a period of time whilst we're going to continue to use oil and gas. So again, there's nothing wrong with talking about maximising homegrown supply, but the conversation and the discussion on oil and gas needs to be slightly more cautious, because we will rely on a vibrant global gas market in particular for a long period of time. And then finally, just before I pass over, just a couple of quick suggestions on what the current Ukraine situation means to government energy policy and what we can do to enhance the view on security of supply. I think firstly, and I mentioned this earlier, I think the idea of putting an energy independence target on a clear legal footing, or at least some sort of regulatory footing, I think is important. Jeremy Hunt talked about that at the autumn statement last week. That will ensure that we are thinking about energy security in the long term rather than just now. Secondly, we should really think about how we assess risks around imports. The Ukraine situation has shown that actually we can't rely on oil and gas pipelines necessarily from overseas. Interconnection is potentially more difficult. So we need to think quite carefully about how we take and consider the risk of international connections and factor those in. And that should hopefully mean that we weight more towards domestic capacity rather than imports. And then thirdly, we should also think about areas to reshore. We should think about other options. We'll no doubt talk about carbon border adjustments in other areas. How can we ensure that we're reshoring not just the core bits of capacity, but also the supply chains to deliver those capacities, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's sources of steel. We should think quite carefully about how we can strengthen the overall national security and economic security framework that then obviously helps deliver additional energy security as well. I'll pause there, Mark, and very keen to hear from the other panelists.
Thank you very much, Josh. Thank you very much for that excellent scene setter, and I think demonstrating the interconnection of a lot of, if you pardon the pun, of a lot of these issues with a variety of other kind of domestic and international kind of political and public policy considerations. Our next speaker is Adam Berman, who's the Deputy Director for Policy at Energy UK, the UK's energy industry body. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you very much. Well, very large shoes to fill there after Josh's introduction. We'd said at the beginning that Josh was going to say the controversial stuff and not me. I might actually reverse it. I haven't been in number 10. I haven't counted power stations one by one. But I do think that a fundamental problem in the way that we look at security of supply and energy security more broadly is we tend to look just at the upstream. It's about big things producing lots of energy that we use. But I think, as we all know, it's a lot more complex than that. Why are we facing very significant challenges this winter and even more significant challenges next winter? Clearly, it's about over-reliance on gas, particularly international imported gas. But I think, again, the reality is more complex. I mean, if we go to actually the demand side first, it's about a systemic failure to invest in energy efficiency. We've got the least efficient housing stock in Western Europe, some of the least efficient housing in Europe, full stop. So it's not just about producing the energy that we use, it's then about using it in a smarter way or not using it, as may be the case. As we all know, the cheapest form of energy is the energy that's never used. I think it's also about struggling to deliver on often very, very bold targets, and I think we should get sort of credit as the UK for coming forward with bold targets when we do so. But again, I think some of the targets we've had on energy security are wonderful for a press statement, and I think the reality is we just struggle month by month afterwards to see them being delivered. Why is it that it takes 7 years on average for planning? Why is it that it takes 10 years for grid connection if you're a new onshore wind or solar or whatever it may be facility? And I think the simple answer to the question on kind of why have we ended up in this situation is that we kind of know that there has been perhaps not enough of a focus on some of the geopolitical challenges around security of supply. And when it comes to how to get out of that route, clearly a doubling down on low carbon energy is a bit of a no-brainer because it's quick, it's cheap, it meets our net zero targets as well. But I think, again, it's about translating these targets into delivery. And if we look at something like the energy security target from earlier this year, a lot of very, very laudable aims in there and things that I think certainly the energy industry stands behind and absolutely wants to deliver. But when we look at the policy reality that stands behind it, so for example, if we want energy security, we're going to have to transition away from gas, so we need things like hydrogen, we need things like CCS for gas and CCS. But we had an energy bill scrapped a few months ago, which would have brought forward really critical financing models that would have meant that when we look into the 2030s, we would have had those technologies ready to ensure that we have a resilient energy system. And as it stands at the moment, I have investors calling up saying, what should I do? So I absolutely think that there has been excellent work on things like security of supply and particularly on the target side. But I think when it comes to delivery, we have been less impressive for some time now.
Thank you very much, Adam. So, having heard from two experts and specialists in various ways in the energy sector, obviously this is a debate about energy security and energy independence. And our third and final speaker is Alicia Kearns, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, MP for Rutland and Melton. Before election, she worked in counter-terrorism and counter-extremism. I think I'm right in saying at the Foreign Office, but also independently more widely. And as we'll all be aware, the Select Committee has been examining very closely the independence or vulnerability of the UK's critical infrastructure in energy and beyond. And so we're very fortunate for her to join us. Over to you.
Morning, everyone. So I'm going to start with the foreign and then move it towards the domestic because, as we all have learned, and I think the public have definitely learned, there is no such thing as foreign policy as this kind of luxury that only certain people in safe seats can bother their heads about. The fact is that foreign policy is inherently linked to our security at home. And that's why Ukraine has been such a wake-up call on energy. It has exposed our energy fragility. It has exposed the fact that we haven't had a conversation with the British public about energy for decades, if not longer. And it also proves, however, some of the naysayers around net zero and renewables that we need to shift to these if we want to be more independent on the world stage and therefore better able to advocate for our ambitions and for ourselves. However, it has also challenged our ability to get to net zero, which I will touch on in a second. I think slightly conversely, I would argue that we haven't got great energy resilience because my worry is that politically it has been a very short-term project, as has been touched on this morning. It has always been, can we get through this winter? Not what are we doing over the next 20 to 40 years? And the problem is that resilience is the biggest issue actually across any subject, I would claim. If you were to ask me one thing that I would want the government to invest in for the next 20 to 40 years, it would be resilience. Because quite rightly, over the last 20 years, we've been focused on the threats of terrorists who behave like states. We are now in a situation where we have states who behave like terrorists. And whether we like it or not, we are in a state of hybrid warfare, where every single part of our society is under attack. Energy is part of that, but so is culture, governance, information, politics, you name it, academia, everything is under attack. But we haven't focused on how we make ourselves resilient to that. And that's going to take us 20 to 40 years, when really we should be focused between now and 2050 on how we get into new technologies, how we lean into R&D. But instead, we're going to have to look at resilience. So in terms of resilience when it comes to energy, obviously there's diversification. We need to look at all the different types of energy we need. There's also then the supply and diversification of supply. For me, my real worry here is that we're all worried about Russia and the fact that it's weaponized energy. But who are we now going to turn to? The other strategic competitors out there, we might not have named them, but is Qatar a reliable partner? Is Azerbaijan a reliable partner? Who are we going to turn to? Look at how the Saudis have weaponized oil in their own way over the last year. So resilience is really, really key, and it's a fundamental issue, not just with energy, but it's my number one ask of all governments over the next 20 to 40 years. So that then takes us to energy diplomacy and where my committee can come in. We need frameworks for energy cooperation, there's no question. For me, the G7 is the core of that, is the key opportunity partner, and we need to look at how we establish those. Now, my big worry is that we'll end up just agreeing frameworks for emergency supply. That's not good enough. We need to look at how we look at our supply as a comprehensive picture over the next 20 to 40 years and recognise that multilateralism when it comes to energy is what we need to look at. The second thing we need to do is trade. You are absolutely right in terms of exporting. If we want to be part of some international energy agreement, we need to bring something to the table, and that could be electricity due to our offshore wind. Now, I'm one of the few, I think, freaks in the country in that I think that onshore wind is actually quite beautiful. However, should it be down to local communities? Absolutely. You know, we believe in conservatism, we believe in localism, but I believe personally that some communities would want to have onshore wind, but it has to be solely with the say of communities. But we should become a net exporter. The biggest issue on energy diplomacy, and something that I want my committee to look at, is critical minerals. We need them to build all these renewables that we keep talking about as if they're some kind of amazing silver bullet. But for example, magnets for wind turbines, that's mostly coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, which country is buying up the Democratic Republic of Congo? Which country is already in there building relationships and forcing reliance on the DSC upon them? It's China. So anywhere we want to go, we are going to face problems. So 80% of the world's copper is in Chile. Do you hear the government talking about Chile and what our relationship is with these key countries that have critical minerals? That, for me, if we were to look at one fundamental within energy policy, it would be critical minerals. And then we have to reduce our reliance overall on hostile states. And by that, I also mean expertise. So there's a real problem with the nuclear conversation that so much of the expertise is Chinese. French have a lot of expertise, but they're a lot more expensive. And this is about recognising that in the short term, paying more for French expertise is better than getting ourselves trapped up with the Chinese. Second is capital and where the funding is at the moment, which I'll touch on in a second, and then the supply chains more broadly. So solar, I'm running a big campaign against a solar plant in my constituency, Mallard Pass. Not because I'm anti-green, I believe we have to invest in it, but the problem is we've been sold this dream on solar energy that it's cheap and clean and great, but 80% of all polysilicon, which is key to solar panels, is made in the Uyghur region. It's coked, it's dirty, but all of us, we've said that's fine. You make your dirty solar panels using slave labour over in the Uyghur region. We're not interested because we don't see it when it gets into our roofs. So we have to also have an adult conversation about what energy looks like. The final thing I wanted to touch on was the domestic, which is, as I started with, we haven't had this grown-up conversation with the public about national security or energy security for the last 20 years. I think the stat was that if every single household was to reduce their thermostat by 1%, we would save 10 billion cubic metres in gas a year. That's the sort of thing we should be asking the British public to step on board. This is a national conversation, it is a national effort. We then have to invest in our natural assets like wind, and then the UK Infrastructure Bank for me is really key here. We know that some businesses, although clearly not the ones calling you, think that there are parts of renewable and energy that are risky. So let's have the UK Infrastructure Bank step in. Let's make sure, especially on decarbonisation, that we are the ones leading it so that the market comes with us. Industrial policy has been talked about in this country as almost a dirty word for the last 20 years. We are now in a situation we cannot allow that luxury of just putting it off the table. So in conclusion, there has been an insufficient focus on resilience over the last 2 decades. Energy diplomacy is key, but for me, it comes down to critical minerals, but also making sure that when we have an energy security conversation, that our energy security objectives and climate change are treated as one, because that's the only way we're actually going to put ourselves on a surer footing.
Thank you very much. Well, an awful lot of food for thought already there from our panellists. We will go to audience questions in just a moment. I think we have 25 minutes for questions. I'm going to use my tyrannical power to ask my own question first, because if you can't do it when you're actually chairing the panel, when can you? Among the various people actively probably hoping for Twitter to fall over may well be Nick Clegg, given that a lot of people will have seen on that platform the video of him in the coalition years saying, oh, why would we make decisions on new nuclear now, and it won't come on stream until 2022, 2023. It reminds me a little bit of the Flight of the Concorde song about an apocalyptic future, which begins the distant future, the year 2000. There's obviously an issue here with short-termism. To what extent is it kind of cultural in our politics, and to what extent is it actually practical in our politics about, say, the electoral cycle or the ability for the impetus on politicians to make decisions for what's happening in the next day or the next winter or by the next local elections, rather than what might happen to the country at a time when they might even have retired to, hypothetically, Silicon Valley to earn a load of money somewhere else. Over to you, Adam.
Yeah, sure. I can kick off on the short-termism. I mean, I think, you know, it is frustrating that we're a few months on from an unprecedented energy crisis. And, you know, if you look at the response from the UK, again, I kind of go back to there are some great targets. What has actually been delivered in the last 8 to 10 months that's manifestly different to the 8 to 10 months before it? We've had some backup, essentially, capacity put in place for this winter. We have some coal, which is sort of mothballed coal, which has come out for this winter. There's a demand-side response program, which the electricity system operator has put out, which means that actually households can be paid to turn down their heat, can be paid to turn down, in this case, their electricity. That's really positive. But again, when we come to that short-termism, if you want to get off gas, because this is an international problem of gas, there is a shortage of gas, gas is too expensive. So surely the solution to that should be using less gas. For example, one of those might be a rapid acceleration of heat pumps in homes. We know that gas for heating is incredibly expensive. I'm terrified each time I come down in the morning and look at the smart meter when you know, my heat's been going on for a couple of hours to wake me up. It is incredibly expensive. So why are we not investing wholesale in a product that is there? Yes, it needs government backing. Yes, it might need government de-risking or government programs, but that's the responsible thing to be doing. I think when it comes to things like the diplomacy with other countries, at least when it comes to kind of primary forms of energy, I absolutely agree there is a need for more of a long-term view on that. But again, the thing that I'm slightly worried about here is the value for money question, is that we now have civil servants going out looking at 10, 15-year gas contracts to the UK. We may end up with a lot of security of supply, and we may end up with incredibly expensive contracts that don't represent good value to consumers. So I'm just saying that there is a balance to be found there. And I think, ultimately, when we come to the question of long-term investment in the UK's energy infrastructure, we do have a fantastic target of net zero power system by 2035, which will frankly power the whole of the economy by 2050. Almost everything's going to be electricity usage by 2050. So we need to ramp up that, but we also need to be realistic that there are going to be moments when the wind isn't blowing, when the sun isn't shining, and we need to come up with solutions for that. And that's about things like hydrogen, pumped hydro storage, it's about CCS, it's about nuclear. All of these things are part of the puzzle. And I think, others will be better placed as to why there is that kind of short-termism when it comes to the energy debate. But I think what has been disappointing is that even as we have faced this unprecedented energy challenge, or at least one that we haven't faced since the 1970s, I'm not convinced that our response has quite leveled up, has quite been to a high enough standard to really face the kind of long-term questions that come out of that.
Alicia.
Well, I think part of the challenge is the fact that we've had hardly a steady ship when it comes to political leadership over the last, I've lost track, it feels like 3 years, but 10 months. 10 months. And I think obviously that is a challenge because you need really brave decisions. I mean, look at Newport Wafer Fab as a far smaller example. That's not talking about our 20-year resilience, but it actually fundamentally is. And we saw it pass from pillar to post until finally Grant Shapps made the right decision, which was to call in a decision and force them to sell their shares. Resilience is not a sexy word, and people don't want to hear resilience. And when I, as an MP, stand up and talk about resilience, I don't hear all my colleagues in the chamber turn and go, oh, wow, I really want to listen to what she's got to say on resilience. It's just not, and it requires 20 to 40 years. And we do have short-termism in our politics. I don't think anywhere near as bad as when I speak to people from other countries, I have to say. But also, we then don't also, even within our civil servants, have long-term thinking, because actually the average civil servant is probably only in a job for 3 or 4 years as well. So why are they going to push for something that's going to deliver in 20 years that's incredibly bold and needs a real challenge? We do need to move past this, and that's where that conversation about a national effort and national responsibility comes back in. And again, on the short term, look at the fact that we didn't have the national campaign about energy use. Whereas in Germany, you go into any government building and by 5 p.m. all the lights have switched off. And across the country, the population are responding. For too long, we have infantilized the public when it comes to too many topics, and that has to end. And energy security is one of the ones where the government can't do it on its own, but it takes a lot of courage to say to the public, we need you to step up too. And that is something we just have to find the confidence to do as politicians, and I don't think it should be that big of a struggle.
No, just on that point, so I completely agree, because when I was in government, whenever we used to send a minister out on a ministerial round in the morning to do press, the first thing we see when they were talking about energy was, don't, whatever you do, mention blackouts. Don't, whatever you do, mention energy security. Because as soon as you mention it, then that's where the story is. That's where the line of questioning goes. And I'm not meaning to say we should send all of you guys out to talk about blackouts, but there is absolutely an honesty piece here. And that's exactly what they're doing in other areas of Europe, to say, look, there is a challenge this winter. We've all got to collectively get together, and now is the opportunity to do that. If we can't do it in the context of a war in Europe, then when can we do that? And that honest conversation needs to be had, because it's not about large changes. It's about small incremental changes that people can make, which don't impact their quality of life, but also potentially get us through a very difficult situation. I think on the politics more generally, at least my experience in government was that the politicians were judged on the 3 to 4 year time horizon rather than the 20 to 40 year time horizon. And actually it was much better to talk about positive opportunities in the near term and then blame the previous lot for the failure to think long term. So we are still now blaming the Labour Party for not building nuclear power stations. That's frankly ridiculous, because the government has been in place for 12 years, and actually there has been the time to start coming up with a proper financing model to start making genuine progress. So that's the sort of honest conversation we need to have, and that is about thinking about the longer term. The final point I just make on the value for money assessment that Adam kind of mentioned, I think that is totally right. What we do in the moment is we say, okay, what mix of energy technologies will deliver the cheapest energy system in 10 years' time? That's not the question we should necessarily be asking. We should be asking what set of energy technologies will deliver both the most secure and resilient system as well as the least cost system in 20 to 40 years' time. Yeah. And that means you might make different decisions. It means you prioritise larger scale investments, potentially in a more wide range of technologies. You also invest in longer term technologies. Pumped hydro is a very good example of that. Really long, big civil work, but actually they take a lot of opportunity to do, and then they deliver for 60 years plus. There's other technologies in that bucket as well. So that definition of how we assess energy security and resilience in combination with cost and climate is the balance that I think we need to get more right.
10-second addition would just be that I think one of the other problems we've looked at the political conversation over the last 12 years is that we've constantly talking about, well, there are going to be future technologies. There's going to be more technologies. But what we've learned from Ukraine and supporting them is actually sometimes you just need to go with what's on the shelf, and you need to look at what's available now rather than pushing the conversation down the road. So I think there is, again, a realism conversation around we don't have time to wait. So it is better to go, right, this is what the current technology mix is, and we can talk about all the sexy stuff that might come out of future agreements once we get there. But the industry, no industry is ready to build those things yet. So focus on what's feasible, what's possible, and make a proper pragmatic plan rather than constantly talking about waiting for technology.
Thank you. Now I can see various hands start to rise around the room. I think, as I said earlier, please do make sure it's a question. Please wait for my colleague with the microphone to reach you, and please say who you are and where you're from. I'll take questions in twos. We'll start here and then here, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Elliot Hammer. I'm a lawyer. I don't really know much about energy. 2 questions linked to what we've been talking about. The first one is narrow. The first one is a bit wider. I see the problem, this is the narrow question. I see the problem that everybody wants energy, but nobody wants the production in their backyard. So nobody wants the the onshore wind farms near them. They don't want the nuclear power stations near them, and the estuary power manufacturer. They don't want their lesser spotted newts to be affected. What do we do about that? So that's a narrow question. Linked to that, do we not have a problem in that the democratic West is far worse at implementing long-term solutions to problems, whereas the authoritarian other countries don't have that problem because they can bulldoze policies through?
Thank you. And we just pass the microphone along here.
Thank you very much. My name is Stuart Agnew. I'm a Norfolk farmer. I happen to live right next door to a 250-acre solar farm. 3 very quick questions, Chairman. The first one is, if we get a 2-week anticyclone in January, very frosty weather, will that automatically mean blackouts? Second question is, what is the reality of hydrogen as a fuel for internal combustion engines? Are we anywhere near it? And the third question, specifically to our Westminster representative, homemade bombs and easily purchased drones could spell disaster for Sizewell. Are we prepared for that? Thank you.
Quite a range of things there. Alicia, I'm going to go straight to you there. We talked about how keenly we should put up politicians to talk about blackouts, so
Yeah.
go.
I can't give you the answer on whether that would cause blackouts, so I will leave it to our energy experts. On the point about constituencies, you are absolutely right. However, in my constituency, we have quite a lot of wind energy, and I think we're quite happy to have it. I've never had a single complaint about it. When I've talked about being pro-wind energy to my constituents, I've actually never had someone challenge me on it. I do think it's horses for courses, whereas we are also one of the key food-producing constituencies in the country. I have over 400 farmers. We don't want solar covering over our agricultural land. It doesn't make sense for us because we've got some of the highest quality agricultural land in the country. So horses for courses. Other areas are desperate for solar. Let them have it. They're also far sunnier than Rutland. On the autocratic point, you again are absolutely right about this, and this comes down to the hybrid warfare point. Any autocratic state has 10 years, 20 years where they decide we are going to throw everything within our system at this goal, and we will achieve it because we don't care about the people, we don't care about the resources, we don't care about the cost. The other challenge we have as Western democracies, if we're quite honest, is transparency. Now, that is something we should be proud of, but it is causing us problems, for example, when it comes to standing up for certain partners and countries around the world, where because we declare everything we do, we tell the autocratic states exactly what we're doing, so they know how we've responded and what we're doing, so that is a challenge. On drones, sir, that is one of the things we are very good at dealing with. Drones will always be a risk. But I can tell you now, if you look at the way we deal with our nuclear sites from the military, the anti-drone technologies they have are significant. I spent 2 days with the Royal Marines about 6 weeks ago looking at precisely this question. If you want anti-drone expertise, you come to Britain. We are exceptional at it. And that is our job, to protect our critical national infrastructure.
Josh.
Thanks, great questions. Just on the production in the backyard point, so my view is very much that central government shouldn't dictate what local communities can and can't do, and ultimately that's what we should think about when it comes to onshore activities, whether they're energy assets, whether they're big manufacturing, whatever they may be. And actually you go to Hull, where there's lots of offshore wind activity, it's supported because there's a huge amount of jobs that have been created. Similarly, around some of the nuclear assets, actually, there's a huge amount of community support because the developers have invested in the local communities. So the critical thing for central government is to get out of the way. And if local communities don't want wind or they don't want solar, they can make that decision. And that's the challenge we've got to get right. It's difficult, totally, but that's the dynamic we've got to create. On the long-term kind of democratic West point, I think you're totally right in terms of the ability and the kind of rough shot over community consent, but I do think there's a role for the Western world to set long-term targets. So we've done that in the net zero context. I think there's value in doing the same when it comes to energy security, and then governments of multiple different colours can then solve for those long-term targets, and that will hopefully ingrain a bit more long-term thinking. We are doing that when it comes to climate. There's potentially opportunities to do it elsewhere as well, and that does come back to the point you actually made earlier around industrial strategy, because that is again something that can outlast an individual government, because you can set up the frameworks that then deliver beyond that. On the question around anti-cyclones, I might leave that to Adam, but I think my view is that is the greatest risk this winter. Significant cold snap over a pretty long period of time could potentially leave us in a difficult position when it comes to gas, and that's why I think it comes back to the conversation around being honest and trying to prepare for those situations in as fast as we can, because there are things we can do around flexing demand, turning down factories, all marginal changes at this stage, but there is a potential to get through that without rolling blackouts. On the hydrogen in internal combustion engines, I think you've seen a trajectory which means that smaller passenger vehicles will now be electric. They're light, they're easy to utilise, they're being produced at mass scale. The challenge is larger vehicles, so HGVs, potentially obviously trains and shipping. That's where the hydrogen role could be potentially much more significant, and I think it's proven that that actually might be where you need the power delivery of a hydrogen fuel, and that's where we need to be investing and innovating. And then I'll leave that because I thought your drone answer was very good.
Adam, has a mild autumn helped us to stockpile and prepare, or has it lulled us into a false sense of security over a harsh winter?
So I think the general consensus now is that it is next winter that is of primary concern. And that's really because over the last few months we've seen Russian gas essentially flow into European stockpiles, into European storage. So it means there is a significant amount of gas to be able to get us through this winter. Clearly, there are always going to be risks, and that's why the government has put in place a number of contingency measures, both around kind of demand-side response to make sure that both households and businesses can turn down gas and electricity usage in relation to some of the market signals. But also, as I said, there are things like coal on standby. There are always going to be those moments, and I think the spring is, that kind of early spring period, late winter is when clearly things are most, I think, when people will be most nervous. But in general, I would say the thing that certainly the energy sector is more concerned about is that longer term question next winter of we don't have the Russian gas to be able to fill European storage. Europe will have to rely significantly more on shipments of gas, of liquid natural gas, into the EU. There is only so much capacity of LNG globally. There aren't LNG tankers like there are oil tankers. They have to be specially designed. You need special facilities both to essentially pump the gas into the vessels, but also you need regasification facilities on land. We happen to have a number of terminals in the UK. Europe, certainly per capita, does not have as many terminals as us. So we have actually been acting as a land bridge where you've had LNG capacity coming into the UK. It's been regasified into the UK system, and then actually it's been pumped out to the EU, and we have been helping protect the security of supply of France and of Northern Europe, both in terms of gas and in terms of electricity, where we've seen net flows over the last few months. So that's a really positive thing, and I think that shows kind of cooperation between both sides. And when we're talking about that longer term question of energy security, of course domestic capacity is going to be really critical, but also, we are not, thousands of miles away from anywhere else. We are by countries which can also offer gas, can also offer electricity, hydrogen, etc. And I think when we're looking both at next winter and beyond, those international linkages, whether it be EU or further afield, will be really critical in ensuring our resilience.
Thank you. Now I'm going to ration questions to one question each. So obviously, the lady here and then the gentleman there, and then I promise we'll come around to this side.
Hello, Anna Halpern-Landy. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Ortis UK, which is a subsidiary of the Ortis Group. We're a renewable energy independent energy producer, and we're very keen. We're U.S. based, as you can tell from my accent, and we're very keen to invest in the UK. Unfortunately, on Wednesday, the UK seemed to send us a very strong message that we're not welcome. And in contrast to my esteemed colleagues on the oil and gas side, who received apparently a very large investment tax credit, we did not. I'd like to understand why. I'd like to understand what you guys think the forward sort of picture is. These are all subsidiary questions of the main question. And how I'm going to justify this to my board when I take my investment case to them. So thank you.
Thank you. Just pass the microphone to this gentleman. Oh, go around.
Good morning. My name's Richard Diamond. I'm retired from gainful employment, but I'm a councillor and cabinet member for education in the London Borough of Bexley. I wanted to pick up on the issue about sort of domestic energy use and what we can do to encourage and help people to use less in their own homes. I've been around long enough in the game to remember when the government came in 2010 and we had the Green Deal that collapsed and various initiatives of that sort. We've got real problems, particularly in social housing, where there is no money around at all at the moment to actually invest in the stock. We know, as Adam told us, that we have some of the least energy efficient stock in the country. We're not going to replace the housing at anything like the pace we need. With the best will in the world, we can only turn over about 0.5% to 1% of the housing stock a year. So most of the homes we have today, we're still going to have 50, 60, 70 years from now. And looking for some initiatives which can actually help and fast forward the improvements we need to make homes more energy efficient in the short term.
Thank you. Adam, Josh, Alicia.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think the frustrating thing here is that the answers are all incredibly obvious and we all know them and we all have known them for quite some time. We have this incredibly inefficient housing stock. We have needed a government communication programme on using less energy and it hasn't happened. You know, we've just had it, I think in the last 2 days, there was a press piece saying that it was going to happen. First, it was going to happen and then Liz Truss's government said that it was, you know, government overreach and therefore shouldn't happen. But I think, again, it goes back to that point Alicia was saying about resilience. This is the responsible thing to do as a government to try and empower people to be able to understand their energy needs and the energy needs of the country and how that's reflected in their home. So I think a government communication programme is going to be really important both in terms of this winter and next winter. I think the next thing I'd say is programmes that actually from both the kind of electricity and gas side that allow households, allow businesses to really respond to market signals. At the moment, most people in their homes, they will not be given any sort of variable price, let's say, in relation to availability of energy. I'm not necessarily saying that should change for everyone, but for some people who can have more flexible energy usage, those that might at the moment be on time of use tariffs, seems entirely sensible to offer them schemes which, for example, would mean they have slightly cheaper energy if they move it to different times of the day. So we need to think about how to roll that out more broadly. There are lots of things you can do in the home, things about turning down the flow rate of boilers. There's lots of things on energy efficiency, getting heat pumps up and running, doing insulation, more double glazing. We have seen, unfortunately, the last major energy efficiency programme from the government, the Green Homes Grant, was, I think, not an overwhelming success. There absolutely have been programmes before that have been a success, so it's not that energy efficiency is this incredibly difficult nut to crack. It's just that we need, I think we need to show political leadership behind it. And I think there has been a lot of emphasis on supply. It's all been about supply. The debate has been, how do we have enough energy, rather than how can we make do with what we've got as much as possible, get every ounce of usage out of it, and then seek more energy further afield if necessary. I think that, to me, is the heart of energy resilience and is at the heart of energy security.
Very good. Just on the investment allowance piece, there are some differences. The levy on oil and gas relates to all of their profits, so it's a larger intervention, and government's kind of tried to target the excess returns for existing renewables. So there are some kind of technical reasons why there isn't in place the allowance. That said, if the oil and gas sector is supported to invest in low carbon technologies through an investment allowance, it seems to me mad if a renewable company is doing the same sort of investment that they wouldn't get the same sort of support. So the argument is more about a level playing field, because the levies are different, but I think there's a fair argument that you've set out, and I think that's totally justified. On the point around kind of domestic energy supply, I think three things I'd say. Firstly, make sure people have smart meters and get the government to sort out the programme on smart meters, because you look at the examples you talked about this winter, flexibility, they're only available to customers who have smart meters. And that's exactly the argument around giving the people the information that they need to then have a company that's innovating to help them flex their demand and therefore reduce their bills. So getting the smart meter programme sorted out is a key thing. The second thing is about energy efficiency support. My personal view is that any government money should be channeled to social housing, housing associations, housing tenants, because ultimately that's where the housing stock is worse, but also there is no ability to necessarily do it at an individual homeowner level. And the government has started to do that, but has talked about additional funding in that space, and I think that's critically important. Obviously, it doesn't deliver for this winter, though, so in reality, you need to think about that as a medium-term output. The final thing I'd say is on the role of the government more generally. You mentioned the UK Infrastructure Bank. They are looking at the moment, I think this is vitally important, around whether they could support banks to offer low-cost loans or zero-interest loans, as they do in Germany, to support homeowners who want to invest in energy efficiency themselves, improve the fabric of their home. And that sort of innovative financing solution, which the UKIB has been created to deliver, is potentially quite game-changing, because it therefore moves you away from an ongoing subsidy protection. It's much more market-wide and potentially allows banks who have a shared load of opportunities to invest in this space and have set all these net zero targets to actually play a part in helping the public both decarbonise but also reduce their energy consumption.
No, it's very difficult for me to add much to that. The only point I'd make is going back to this criticism of the fact that, well, Liz Truss deciding to can a government education campaign. Empowering people and giving them the information to make choices about their own lives is inherently a Conservative policy. The idea that this was going to be forceful or interventionist or overreach the state is offensive, to be frank. But then when we do have this campaign come forward, if we don't have black hats, if we get through everything with solid energy security, as we should do throughout the year, because we focus on supply quite rightly, as you mentioned earlier, I then don't want to see media headlines government frittered away £2 million on communications campaign to educate the public because, look, it wasn't needed, was it? That's the sort of problem that we face when it comes to politics. You try and do the right thing, and then all of a sudden it's, well, didn't need to do that campaign, did you? Didn't really make a difference. Look at all that money wasted. Again, it comes back to this, essentially, we need also a responsible climate for this conversation for us to have with the public.
Thank you. Now, we have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to take 2 brief questions with brief answers, please. Here and then here.
My name's Andrew Smith. I'm Head of Public Affairs at Weber Shandwick. About 15 years ago, I was the advisor to the then Shadow Energy team. And going back to the point we spoke about this morning about the lack of long-term thinking, one of the things I played a role in was changing the then Conservative opposition's attitude to nuclear new build. Since then, we've had 15 years of panels like this talking about the lack of long-term thinking. We've had 12 years of Conservative government, but we still haven't yet broken ground on any new nuclear power stations. If there was one thing or a couple of things you could do in the final 2 years of this Parliament, what do you think? Because, I mean, obviously the government have, there have been planning changes, there have been finance changes to try and inject longer-term thinking. But what do you think, why do you think that those have failed, and what do you think we need to do in the final 2 years of this Parliament to make a meaningful difference to this issue about long-term planning and delivering long-term solutions such as nuclear power?
Thank you. And could you pass the microphone over your left shoulder, please?
Thank you very much, Patrick Timms, Walls of Westminster. I might be about to embarrass myself here because I missed the first few minutes of this, so if this is a topic that was covered before, I'm afraid I missed it. My question really, it relates to, it is a domestic policy issue. It's to do with the circular economy. And where this question comes from is the fact, so one of my primary income streams when I'm not doing political journalism is translation. So I do a lot of translation for places, well, Belgium mainly, and so you have industrial clusters at places like the Port of Antwerp, Western, now the Port of Antwerp, Bruges, and there's 2 primary things that the circular economy means to them. One of them is reuse of waste streams. So when one company or industry's waste actually becomes the raw material for another. Then you have things like heat flows, where you have heat grids underneath, excess heat that's generated by one particular company is reused by another. They are doing a lot of really good work on this. What occurs to me there is, what are we doing with the circular economy? And that, of course, is just an industrial context, but actually you also then have, well, what could we be doing in a, household context, and over there you do have quite a lot of local authorities that are implementing the same sort of thing.
Thank you very much. So I'll prevail on the panel just because my very organised and efficient events team will have my guts for garters if I overrun too much for brief answers, but to 2 very interesting questions. Josh.
Yeah, very good questions. On the long-term piece, it's an obvious one, but sorting out the financing for new nuclear. New nuclear has political support on both sides of the House. It has done for years. It's about the financing model. We're finally getting there with Sizewell, but that model is not necessarily immediately replicable elsewhere. So sorting out the right financing model for a multitude of nuclear power stations at a different sort of level is the biggest thing we could do to actually then drive the sector forward. Complex, but clearly vital. On the reuse circular economy point, I totally agree. 2 things. Firstly, government cracking on with the longer-term waste reforms. It's got a set of kind of the enhanced, the producer responsibility side, as well as some of the longer-term broader waste reforms they're looking at. Those need to happen. They've been delayed for years, but they will help the reuse argument in the UK. And then finally, we spend our lives arguing around heat pumps versus hydrogen in people's homes. Heat networks is a great potential near-term opportunity to get low-carbon heat and reuse heat in people's homes that we don't talk enough about, but actually is a great UK potential success story.
Thank you. Alicia.
I think actually one of the fundamental problems that we're actually missing is the expertise point domestically within the UK. And actually I don't think we have a lot of business conversations going on, and then separately we have the civil service and the politicians, and the twain very rarely meet. In the same way as that there are programs now being run to educate politicians and civil servants about China and how we engage with China and how we have a whole of state response to China, we need a whole of state response to energy, and that requires an education piece to take place and for the time to be made for it. But it is still being treated as this isolated, extreme, only in times of crisis issue. So it goes back to my point earlier about the fact we need to have a national focus on resilience. We need to have a national resilience lead. We need to have something within the Cabinet Office that's solely focused on all of this. And when I've looked at the so-called threat pictures, there are so many things missing from it. And actually, we shouldn't be looking at threats, we should be looking at resilience, because you never know what threat's going to come, but you can make yourself more resilient overall. And then that just takes us back to all the points we've made earlier, which is not just supply, making sure we have international leadership, and the UK is doing it. No country in the world is as good at convening internationally as Britain. When we ask people to come and convene, they come. We should be leading on this international energy diplomacy, and then absolutely the focus on vulnerable houses and where we know people are most going to feel this and most struggle to deal with the crisis as it comes, and actually where their infrastructure and the homes they have to live with is not built up enough to support them to make what they need to do, essentially.
Thank you. Adam Berman.
Yeah, just final comments. Yeah, I mean, completely agree on nuclear financing model. We need to agree to Sizewell C. I mean, nominally we've had it. Yes, again, we've had a government that says we commit to Sizewell C, but the contract has yet to be signed. So when I see the ink on the paper, I'll believe it. But I mean, if we don't see Sizewell C, I think it will send a really, really dreadful message about the future of the nuclear industry in the UK and ultimately undermine most of the realistic modelling that we have about how we reach net zero. I think beyond that, there has been a fundamental question about value for money to the consumers versus which countries are interested from countries that which companies are interested from countries that we are interested to have invest in the UK. I think that is always an uncomfortable issue. I would say SMRs are also the kind of next stage. You know, we are very close to kind of the prototype from Rolls-Royce now being operational, and we need a regulatory framework fairly quickly once that is the case to be able to roll them out. On the question on the kind of circular economy, yes, I mean, again, I think, you know, we have the clusters, which is great, and you've got things like hydrogen, CCS, etc., which are enabled through them. But again, we have financing models for hydrogen and CCS, which should have gone through the House a few months ago through the Energy Security Bill, that at the moment are sitting on a desk somewhere waiting. Investors are sitting with final investment decisions on their desk waiting for the government to green light it. So we just need, now that we have the target, we need the delivery on the policies and the actual financing mechanisms that investors can sign up to.
Well, thank you very much. I know there's a huge amount more we could talk about in this topic. I'm sure we'll also return to it as Conservative Home on our site and in future events. It just falls to me to say thank you to the audience in the room for your questions. Thank you to the audience on YouTube. We will be back in a few minutes for our next session on Vote Blue, Go Green, exploring the Conservative case for net zero. Lots to talk about there too, but please join me in a great round of applause. Say thank you to our wonderful